my first thoughts about this, the issue, and when I sent the proposal of this little sort of mini provocation manifesto, came after a conference that I attended in 2015 in Montreal called the Post-Photographic Condition. It was a conference for me that strained to confront and sustain a photography sphere that was imploding at the same time as the proliferation of images was drowning its long authoritative status, no less most of its authorities. So it's a little bit of a provocation and meant to be a bit playful and maybe a little bit hysterical. So I hope you'll bear that in mind. And I want to open with a picture with an image. So I'm going to read to try to keep it within time. So I hope that's okay. At almost every point in the history of representation, there's been and continues to be a necessary debate concerning the incessant presence and the proliferation of images and their reverberations, their dangers, pleasures, their populism, their political effect, their role as propaganda, persuasion, excess, inevitability, no less their status as real in any sense. Indeed, the constant crisis of image culture comes in the reciprocity or clash between what is visual and what can be rendered visible. That seems to be the core of the discussion, even since the opening speech about the black hole. What is visual and what is visible? And it's crucial to the history of photography, as it is to the entire history of modernity's inebriation with apparatuses that constituted visuality as its decisive, even universal epistemological form. This history has been deconstructed and reinforced, upended and reinvented time and time again in ever-shifting implementations. Nevertheless, still intricate aspects of the intersections between representation, causality, history, technology, the apparatus, surface in the kind of histories that have emerged in the past decades and demonstrate that a deeper analytic understanding of the photographic, referenced in the previous panel, now wrongly called post-photographic, and that have been obligated to grasp astonishing transformations in image production, image creation, image distribution, image reception, and the vast new territories that images inhabit. All this linked with the triumphant promise of an AI whose reach now extends into every sphere. Indeed, the artificial industrial complex and the maturing technologies of the cognitive industries pose the most serious perils to a human future. And though many of the consequences were recognized decades ago, the pace and scale of such integrated convergences is still hard to fathom. Yet it's indisputable that the transformation near supremacy of image technologies led one of my colleagues recently to quip, "Everything is photography." Nevertheless, endless streams of images of airline meals, exotic barista creations, ridiculous pets, oddball acquaintances, wine labels, forlorn lovers, casual bar brawls, narcissistic self-indulgence to the point of mind-numbing psychosis, also known as selfies, proliferate and are ironically joined with consequential recordings of brazen police brutality, if not outright murder, the wretched circumstances of mistreated refugees, undeniable evidence of chemical weapon attacks, indiscriminate bombings, racist tirades, upskirt, and other forms of photographic sexual assault. In short, a ubiquitous representational sphere linked with the undeniable momentary meaning of images, with either the hope to get them seen, or maybe we should say liked, or the urge to just store them forever into a vast data repository that might serve as a metaphor for the nearly instantaneous forgetting and the infinitesimal possibility that they might find some relevance again or at all. It might not be excessive to suggest that the so-called cloud, the retention of meaning, in the cloud, the retention of meaning is sacrificed in favor of the retrieval of data. Or maybe, as filmmaker Chris Pettit ruminates in his important 2010 film, Content, he said, The logic of forgetting. This needs to be investigated or forgotten. An astonishing system of accumulation has been created, one with essentially little meaningful purpose other than the sundering of subjectivity or reflection. Zizek wrote, I stumble around in this infinite space where messages circulate freely without fixed destination, but the whole of it remains beyond my comprehension. Wilhelm Flusser said it another way. In 1986, he said, about in an essay on electronic memory, he said, our praxis with electronic memories forces upon us the abandonment of the self. In this new economy, the new comes with extraordinary consequences. The new reality, ones that rapacious and omnipresent. It's a new that's desolate. It's a wait for speed bumps fueled by empty promises of 4G, 5G, 6G, the G economy, needless apps, upgrades, because the new has become a kind of special effect itself, because new is the obsolescence of critical thinking. The new anticipates its own demise and celebrates itself as defunct, exhausted by its own vacuity. New is time stripped of its succession. New is futurism's triumphant abandonment of experience in favor of sensation. New is a dictatorship of the immediate. It's a propaganda system devoid of an ideology. It's a submission to everything as obsolescent. It's the admission of defeat, surrender, ceding everything to an intractable momentary deceit. It shatters the coordinates of reason, subsumed in the continuous onslaught of information. The new is passé. It's a transparent myth of a social communities drifting in indeterminacy. It's impervious to criticism. It's complicit with the momentary valuations and is situational in a profoundly dangerous form, because the new has become a kind of phantasmagoria of a culture mesmerized by consumption. New is a kind of coercion in its most potent form. It annihilates and is indifferent to individuals, to culture, to meaning. New is uncertainty, but without the principle. The new is anti-humanism in its triumphant gesture of tautology, and it's the evisceration of the imagination. And along with this apocalyptic new has come accumulating consequences. So for the purposes of this talk, one repercussion is the development of an omnipresent archive of largely inconsequential images, an unrelenting instant archive. The instant archive, switch one image. Give me one sec, give me one sec. The instant archive is the autonomous, fugitive structure of uncoordinated uploads constituted as a kind of snapshot, pun intended. Oops, screen share. Sorry. A kind of snapshot, pun intended, of an utterly unmediated vision of a partial and fleeting avalanche of pseudo-realities. It's an archive so dispersed, amorphous, so unstructured, so temporary that it's disruptive. It's almost out of control. It's contingent rather than determinate. It's decentered and a bit wild. It's premised on no particular point of view. It's ephemeral, transient, only momentarily present, and subject to constant revision, a temporary dispositive. An instant archive is idiosyncratic, with unpredictable, unstable, unrepeatable, and often unreliable contents. It is sometimes conditional, sometimes not, sometimes unconditional, sometimes not. It's prospective, perhaps it's trajective. It posits probabilities, but it has no telos. It's unhinged, it's existential, pointlessly imminent, rudely tendential, has only conjectural, sketchy, or fictitious correspondences, even while it possibly contains dramatically pertinent content. The instant archive is an absurd database with inexhaustibly dubious criteria and merely marginal hope for concrete outcomes. Nobody knows who this data is actually for or whose interest it is present in the world. The instant archive is that of the amnesiac. It might contain repressed memory, might contain recovered memory, might not contain any memory at all, rather only shoddy, faulty, or partial impressions. This instant archive is without purposeful intentionality. It cannot anticipate any real effect, but can merely relish and congratulate itself for any providential content it might contain or reveal. It's without any guiding agenda. It only operates by chance. Actual meaning is just a probability. With or without metadata, the logic of its instantaneous, uncertain state would likely defeat any standard operating procedure to gain control or make any reasonable order of it. The instant archive is as unruly as the impulsive agents who produce it. In the end, it's hard to tell if the instant archive is radically subversive or serendipitously accidental. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's neither. Maybe it doesn't matter. The instant archive is the sphere of blurry selfies and pointless and rootless attempts at self-promotion. The instant archive is the archive we deserve, a futile mise en scène, futility par excellence. So what do we do in the spheres of the new and the instant archive? Maybe like for Abel Gance, channeling Dante, he said, abandon all hope, ye who enter the hell of images, or Godard, who said, too many images, we must take action. Yet we cannot all be held accountable for the unintentional image tsunamis sweeping into the gigantic data stores proliferating in the so-called cloud. The massive data storage farms dot the Arctic Circle and store millions of images uploaded every second. Laszlo told us how many. They warm the planet and they're parasitic on the ecosystem. We simply cannot replace the sea ice or the fast depletion of rare earth metals or the dwindling species driven to extinction by global warming with a Frankenstein monster of triumphantly superfluous images as some kind of twisted state of momentary virtuality, no less reality itself. Trillions of files, trillions of instants, so much so that even long ago, Eli Theophilakis said, wait, let me switch slides, give me one sec. The capacity of our sensory apparatus has been exceeded. In this glut, we don't seem to stand a chance, but we don't have to. The overwhelming majority of an overwhelming majority of an overwhelming majority of these images are of absolutely no consequence, and we have no responsibility at all to be accountable to them. It would be a degenerate JPEG economy. They are waste, awful byproducts of unrelenting accumulation by the omnivorous capture of images by security cameras, facial recognition systems, FaceTime, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, blah, 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 blah. No less all the mad uploads that saturate hard drives and inundate in a near cosmic depository, emptying of anything but the useless dark matter of our flourishing image garbage. An archive so vast as to be inconceivable, one that might contain, by some perverse logic, a history of the whole enterprise of modernity's collapsing presence on Earth, save everything, or as Baudrillard suggested, as a hysterical archive of modernity. I'll show you another image. Our entire and accumulative, linear and cumulative culture would collapse if we could not stockpile the past in plain view. So much thinking about the trajectory of photographs, we've heard so much of it in this conference, that it's daunting to attempt a reckoning. So here I offer just a sampling of 4 assessments for theorists Willem Flusser, Hito Stierl, Serge Dene, and Ariella Azoulay. These, while many, many others, are also scrambling to wonder if photography is everything, or if there's such a thing as post-photography, or perhaps if every image is simply telling a lie, or is just an instantaneous true. These are issues that have been thought about for many, many decades. So first, a small quote. I'm just going to post them as quotes, and then we can maybe have questions and talk about them a little bit. From Flusser, one of the key figures in the historical understanding of the relationship between photography as a media and photography as a meaning. And one second, sure. And here's a comment from Flusser. This is from 1986. It says, the new photo will differ from the chemical one. Oh, screen share. The new photo will differ from the chemical one in that it will be practically eternal. It will render total art possible, and it will permit democracy to function. What an optimist. The new photo is thus an example of an emerging culture of immaterial information. All useful activities will be executed by apparatus. The individual will become free to elaborate pure information in dialogue with all the others. This information will be stored in unperishable memories. It will be total art, and every human being will become potentially a universal artist. This human being will no longer exist as a subject to an objective universe, but as a knot within a social network. How reactionary and how predictive, because social networks that he might have speculated about in the 1960s have become the social networks today, which are the avalanche and the ocean in which all of these images exist. So Hito Stierl, also a fascinating, complicated figure, but one I think who's had tremendous influence on contemporary, particularly contemporary young culture, who are trying to understand what images do, where they come from, and what they might mean. And so she posted this essay in 2015, I believe, called In Praise of the Poor Image. And she says, the poor
Timothy,
image.
we can see the screen,
Oh,
so maybe you would like to. Yeah, perfect.
Sorry about that. So the poor image embodies the afterlife of many former masterpieces of cinema and video. She's talking about images that can be cut and pasted from network searches. It's been expelled from the sheltered paradise that cinema seems to have once been, after being kicked out of the protected and often protectionist area of national culture, discarded from commercial circulation. These works have become travelers in the digital no man's land, constantly shifting their resolution and format, speed and media, sometimes even losing their names and credits along the way. The poor image is no longer about the real thing, the original. Instead, it's about its own real conditions of existence, about swarm circulation, digital dispersion, fractured and flexible temporalities. It is about defiance and appropriation, just as it is about conformism and exploitation. So maybe two kinds of history theory here, Flusser and Stierl. One reflective, one reflexive, one engaged with disruptive but urgent historical discourse, the other indirectly engaging distribution itself. Two agencies tied to two forms of media, in this case, image media, which sustained efficacy in the field in the face of constantly swirling challenges, theoretical and technical, as has been discussed in the conference, and always heading towards a kind of collapse, implosion into contingency, as was discussed in the last session. Flusser, for example, could only speculate about social network of the time without imagining the kind of social nets that wildly proliferate. But the juxtaposition of Flusser-Stierl is just one instance of a kind of opposition or difference. Another could be suggested differently between the two decades in the work of Serge Dene and Ariella Azoulay. In the early 1990s, the pivotal French film critic Dene began a series of essays for the journal Libération, At a significant moment, as he reflected on the televised coverage of the First Gulf War in 1991, the essay Montage Oblige, translated into English as Montage Obligatory, appeared. And he said, let me switch images again, one sec. Faith, he said, I'm sorry, a faith in images has turned bad, a bad faith which translates into the sad passion of always having the last word. The rarefaction of the image begins when the twin acts, seeing and showing, are no longer natural and have become like acts of resistance. Then it's up to us to imagine what we no longer see. Imagination is the ghost of the image. It is our bitter victory. If the visual prevents us from seeing, because it prefers that we decode, decrypt, in short, read, the image always challenges us to edit with another, with the other, because in the image, as in democracy, there's always something at stake, something incomplete, an incision, a first incision, or a gap. This is such an interesting take. And just a couple more, 1 or 2 more minutes and I'll be finished. So Azule comes from a very different position. And in the most important, maybe the best read of these books, called The Civil Contract of Photography, Azule poses this issue yet in a much more interesting, dramatic form, saying, the conquest of the world as picture is enacted simultaneously by everyone who holds a camera, serves as the object of a photograph, or looks at photographs. The conquest of the world as picture was photography's vision from the very beginning and is newly performed at each and every moment. The dynamic partnership of everyone in the fulfillment of this vision, their participation in the conquered world as picture, and the powers that conquer, the photographer and its spectators, however, actually prevents the completion of the process of turning the world into a mere picture. This partnership makes the conquest of the world through the accumulation of more and more pictures, an ongoing and unfinished project. Within a social context, the logic of photography exceeds the singular act of photography and is woven into the net of a plurality of people who are photographing at the same time, lending their human gaze to the mechanized gaze and others in a way that is essentially escapes their control. This is the origin of the ontological difference that marks the status of the image in an era that began with the invention of photography. This is what allows the logic of photography to overpower social relations while at the same time providing a point of resistance against photography's total domination, initiating the responsibility to prevent the overdetermination of this domination. So it's a very subtle argument. And I just want to say one more thing, that perhaps with all of this, and I hope this opens a debate, we could reflect on a comment that was made by Adorno. He made a very interesting comment that I'll show you. Second. He made this comment in his book.
Sorry, once again, there is a problem
yes,
with
I'm getting it. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here's the comment from Adorno. It's from his book of Reflections, Minima Moralia. The objective tendency of the Enlightenment to wipe out the power of images over man is not matched by any subjective progress on the part of enlightened thinking towards freedom from images. And this is where I'll stop.